The room already smells like ink and paper when Louis B. Mayer stops talking. Los Angeles, early 1930s. A Bank of America office downtown, high ceilings, heavy desks, no decoration meant to impress. The windows are tall but grimy, letting in a flat gray afternoon light that refuses to warm anything it touches. There is no music, no phones ringing, just the faint scratch of a pen somewhere behind a partition. Mayer is standing near the desk, hat still in his hand. He hasn't sat down yet, he usually doesn't have to. A moment earlier he had been smiling, not broadly, not foolishly, just enough. The practiced smile of a man who owns soundstages, faces on posters, entire futures tied up in contracts thinner than the paper they're printed on. A man used to being received. Across from him, A.P. Giannini hasn't returned the smile. Giannini doesn't raise his voice, he doesn't interrupt. He waits until Mayer finishes his sentence, the one meant to glide them past this meeting like so many before it. Then he reaches for the check on the desk. He turns it over. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough that everyone in the room can see the back. Giannini taps the paper once with his finger. And then he stops moving. No one speaks. The silence isn't awkward, it's deliberate, it has weight. The kind of silence that makes men suddenly aware of where they're standing and who invited them there. Mayer looks down at the check, he doesn't bend, he doesn't step closer, he just looks. His smile stays in place for a second too long, as if his face hasn't yet been informed that something has changed. The penciled condition on the back isn't long, it doesn't need to be. Giannini doesn't explain it. He doesn't need to. This is not a negotiation, this is not even a warning. It's a pause. And in that pause, something fundamental in Hollywood shifts, quietly, invisibly, without a single headline to mark it. Because Mayer understands before anyone else does what that condition means, not for this loan, not for this month, but for who gets to keep standing in rooms like this and who doesn't. The check stays turned over. Giannini's hand rests beside it, relaxed, unhurried. The banker is not looking at Mayer anymore. He's waiting. To understand why this moment is dangerous, you have to understand what kind of man Louis B. Mayer believes himself to be when he walks into that office. By the early 1930s, Mayer isn't just running MGM, he is MGM. The studio's power, its discipline, its polish, its ruthless efficiency, those things reflect him. He controls stars the way other men control machinery. Contracts are airtight, public images are curated, private problems are buried before they surface. On the lot, Mayer is not contradicted lightly. When he speaks, people listen. When he pauses, people panic. And for years, that authority has followed him everywhere. Into restaurants, into private homes, into boardrooms where others convince themselves that cinema is the future and Mayer already owns it. But banks are not studios. And A.P. Giannini is not impressed by posters. Giannini built his reputation on something Hollywood prefers not to think about: numbers that don't care who you are, payrolls that arrive whether the picture is finished or not, interest that accumulates in silence. Bank of America under Giannini has financed growth across California, agriculture, infrastructure, industry, and yes, motion pictures, but always with one unglamorous rule: credit is power and power must remain quiet. That's why this meeting isn't loud. That's why there are no raised voices. That's why the most important sentence in the room isn't spoken out loud at all. Mayer's people, men who handle legal matters, men who handle schedules, men whose job is to make sure Mayer never looks surprised, are suddenly very still. They don't lean in. They don't ask questions. They've learned, over years of surviving proximity to Mayer, that stillness is sometimes the safest response. Because the condition on the check isn't about money. It's about control. Giannini doesn't threaten to pull funding, he doesn't reference missed payments or future risk. He doesn't mention the depression, though it hangs over the city like a low cloud, touching everything, sparing nothing. He simply leaves the check turned over and waits for Mayer to react. This is where Mayer usually regains momentum. This is where he reframes, reasserts, reminds the other man who benefits from the relationship. He's done it dozens of times before in dozens of rooms. But something about the way Giannini waits, without expectation, without urgency, disrupts that rhythm. Mayer clears his throat. It's a small sound, almost nothing. In another room, it wouldn't matter. Here it echoes. He says Giannini's name, calmly, respectfully, the way you address someone when you still believe the conversation is equal. Giannini finally looks up. Not sharply, not coldly. Just directly. He doesn't answer right away. The silence stretches again, long enough for Mayer to feel it pressing against the edges of his confidence. Long enough for him to realize that Giannini is not playing the same game. Because this isn't about charm. It's not about influence. It's about whether the studio's lights stay on next Friday. And for the first time in a very long time, Mayer is not the man who controls the clock. Hollywood rarely talks about moments like this. There are no photographs, no memos leaked, no memoirs written about a banker turning over a check and changing the temperature of a room. The industry prefers stories where power announces itself loudly, with contracts, firings, scandals. But the most effective power often does the opposite. It waits. This office is proof of that. Giannini knows that if Mayer leaves this room without agreeing, without acknowledging the condition, even implicitly, nothing dramatic will happen that day. No guards, no headlines, no phone calls. Just delays. A pause here, a question there. A recalculation that quietly ripples outward until people who have never heard of A.P. Giannini start wondering why checks are arriving late. That's the leverage. And Mayer can feel it now. His smile finally fades. Not all at once, just enough that the men around him notice, just enough that they understand something has slipped even if they don't yet know what. Mayer glances at the back of the check again. The penciled line hasn't changed. It doesn't need to. Because the moment he acknowledges it, out loud or not, Hollywood's balance of power tilts away from the studio gate and toward the ledger. Giannini doesn't push. He doesn't fill the silence. He lets Mayer sit with it. And that restraint is what makes the moment terrifying. Because Mayer knows this isn't a battle he can win with force. Only with acceptance. The check remains upside down. The room remains quiet. And somewhere, deep beneath the confidence that built an empire, Louis B. Mayer realizes that Hollywood has been renting its power, not owning it. Not really. The question now isn't whether he'll agree. It's what agreeing will cost, and who else will feel it once he does. The silence holds. And it does not let go. Mayer doesn't refuse. That's the first thing Giannini notices. He doesn't argue either, not yet. He simply straightens the crease in his jacket sleeve and shifts his weight, a subtle movement that signals calculation rather than surrender. For a man like Mayer, refusal would be clean, loud, defiant. This is something else. Giannini watches him carefully. The check is still upside down between them, like an object neither man wants to touch first. Outside the office, Los Angeles moves on. Streetcars grind along their rails. Typewriters clatter in buildings full of people who don't know their paychecks are being discussed in silence a few floors above them. The Depression has made money feel fragile everywhere, but inside this room it feels precise, surgical. Mayer finally speaks again. Not about the condition. About time. He mentions upcoming productions, tight schedules, overseas distribution. He talks as if the machine is already in motion, as if it cannot be slowed without consequence. It's a familiar tactic: imply inevitability, make resistance feel irresponsible. Giannini listens. He doesn't interrupt. He lets Mayer finish every sentence. Then calmly he turns the check back over, just for a moment, just long enough to confirm the amount. He nods once as if satisfied. And then he turns it back again. The condition reappears. It's a small gesture, almost polite. And it carries more pressure than any raised voice could. Because now the implication is clear: Giannini has heard Mayer's argument, he has accepted none of it, the terms have not moved. This is not a conversation, it's a boundary. Mayer's people exchange brief glances, nothing overt, nothing that could be read as dissent, but they understand what this means. The studio doesn't just borrow money from the bank, it borrows flexibility, time, the ability to absorb mistakes quietly. Lose that and every delay becomes visible. Every over-budget picture becomes a liability. Every star's contract becomes a risk calculation instead of a show of confidence. Mayer inhales slowly through his nose. He doesn't look angry, that would be too revealing. Instead, his expression settles into something tighter, focused, controlled. He asks a single question. Not about the condition itself, but about how long it will apply. Giannini answers just as carefully. Not with a date. With a standard. A threshold. Something measurable but not easily rushed. That's when Mayer understands the real consequence. This isn't a one-time concession, it's an ongoing leash. And once it's attached, it doesn't need to be pulled to be felt. Giannini isn't interested in creative decisions. He doesn't care about scripts or stars or what stories MGM tells the world. What he cares about is predictability, stability, assurance that the numbers on the page reflect reality, not ambition. For Hollywood, ambition has always been the engine. Now it's being quietly reclassified as a risk. Mayer nods. Once. Not in agreement, not in gratitude. In acknowledgement. The check stays where it is, no signatures are added, no hands are shaken, but something has been decided all the same. When Mayer finally leaves the office, he doesn't linger in the hallway. He doesn't speak until they reach the elevator. Even then, his instructions are minimal, controlled, delivered in the same measured tone he used moments earlier but now stripped of warmth. Back at the studio, the consequences don't arrive with announcements. They arrive as adjustments. Budgets reviewed more closely, green lights delayed pending confirmation, projects that once would have sailed through now require extra justification, not because Mayer doubts them, but because someone else must be reassured. The change is subtle enough that most people don't notice it right away. Except the ones closest to the margins. A production manager whose overtime request is denied without explanation. A director told to simplify a scene that would have required an extra day of shooting. A star informed that a start date is flexible, even though it never used to be. These aren't punishments. They're signals. And they all trace back to that check turned over in a quiet office with a penciled condition no one was meant to talk about. Mayer never mentions Giannini by name in meetings. He doesn't have to. The studio learns quickly what is expected. The message travels without being spoken. Certainty has become conditional. And conditional power behaves differently. It makes people cautious. It makes them self-correct. It makes them enforce limits on themselves so no one else has to. That's the hidden efficiency of financial pressure. Once applied, it spreads without effort. Giannini never calls to check in. He never asks for updates. The bank doesn't hover. It doesn't need to. The knowledge that it could intervene is enough. Mayer, for his part, adapts. He always does. He tightens control in other ways. He leans harder on contracts. He demands more loyalty, more discipline, more silence. If external power has intruded, internal power must compensate. And for a while it works. The studio remains profitable, pictures are released, the public sees no cracks. But something has shifted behind the curtain. Decisions that once belonged entirely to Hollywood are now being made with an invisible audience in mind. A man who will never visit a soundstage, who will never attend a premiere, but whose approval shapes what is possible. And the most unsettling part is this. No one ever announces it. There is no memo that says, the bank is watching. There is only a growing awareness that some risks are no longer worth taking. Some conversations are better left unfinished. Some ambitions are better delayed. Because somewhere in an office that smells like ink and paper, a man can still turn a check over and wait. And the industry will adjust itself accordingly. By the time Mayer fully understands how far that adjustment will reach, it's already too late to undo. Because the power he ceded wasn't loud enough to resist. It was quiet enough to accept. Years later, when people talk about the golden age of Hollywood, they describe certainty. They talk about ironclad studios, unbreakable moguls, stars locked into long contracts like fixtures bolted to the ground. They talk as if power, once established, simply stayed where it was placed. But Louis B. Mayer never forgot that afternoon. Not the check. Not the pencil mark. Not the way the room had gone quiet without anyone raising a hand or a voice. Because once you've seen power exercised that efficiently, you start to recognize its echo everywhere. Mayer adjusts his behavior, but something deeper shifts with it. He becomes more vigilant, less indulgent, less willing to let momentum carry a decision forward without interrogation. On the surface, it looks like discipline. Internally, it's caution. Hollywood doesn't notice the change all at once. It never does. The system absorbs it the way it absorbs everything, quietly, by normalizing it. But the consequences accumulate. Riskier projects disappear into development limbo. Stories that challenge public sentiment are delayed, softened, or quietly abandoned, not because anyone has ordered them killed, but because the margin for error has narrowed. Because failure now carries an additional, unspoken cost. And Mayer knows exactly where that cost leads. He doesn't talk about Giannini, he doesn't complain about Banks, he doesn't frame the moment as a loss. Publicly, there is nothing to lose. Privately, there is a line he no longer crosses. The most powerful men in Hollywood begin to operate with a new instinct: anticipate restraint before it's demanded. It's efficient. It keeps the machine running. It avoids embarrassment. It also changes the culture. Authority becomes less performative and more procedural. Control is exercised through schedules, budgets, approvals, systems that feel neutral, even fair, while quietly enforcing limits. And that's the lesson that lasts. Giannini never steps into the spotlight. He never needs to. His influence isn't measured in headlines, but in absence, in the films that aren't made, the risks that aren't taken, the careers that plateau without explanation. He doesn't collect trophies. He collects compliance. Mayer eventually leaves MGM. History will attribute that to boardroom politics, shifting alliances, changing tastes. All of that is true. But underneath it is a quieter truth. Once power is proven conditional, it never fully recovers its original shape. The check may have been signed. The condition may have been met. But the memory of that silence lingers. It lingers in how studios deal with lenders. In how financial backers shape creative outcomes without ever touching a script. In how Hollywood learns, again and again, that the most dangerous sentence is sometimes the one that isn't spoken. That moment in the bank office doesn't end when Mayer walks out. It repeats. In different rooms. With different men. Always quietly. Because the real shift wasn't about one studio or one loan. It was about the realization that power doesn't have to announce itself to be obeyed. It just has to wait. And somewhere, even now, decisions are still being made with an unseen hand in mind. Not loudly. Not defiantly. But carefully. On someone else's terms. And that is the kind of power that never really leaves the room.